Hello and welcome to the News Minute. Today we look at the dramatic upheaval in Nepal, where a simmering anger against systemic corruption has finally erupted into a full-blown political crisis. To help us understand what's happening on ground, we are joined by a voice from the region itself. Roman Gautam is editor of Himal Southasian, a digital magazine with a pan-regional focus on South Asia. He's also a native of Kathmandu. This movement, which was led by largely the Gen Z generation, which was tired of years of political failure, began as a social media campaign against corruption and nepotism. But a recent Nepali government ban on social media platforms, which was seen as an attempt to silence dissent, acted as a catalyst to intensify these protests. Over the last 2 days, we have seen the violence spiraling, the resignation of the Prime Minister, and the deployment of army in major cities. So we're going to talk to Roman to understand the situation in Nepal, the reporting around it, especially by the Indian mainstream media, and what is likely to happen next. Thank you, Roman, for joining us here on the News Minute.
Thank you so much, Dhanya. Really good to be here.
And before I go to Roman with my questions, I want to tell everyone listening that you must read Roman's article in Himal Southasian. The website is called himalmag.com. The headline of the article is Nepal's Horrific Reckoning with its Failed Political Class. It's a very detailed take in which Roman takes you through the political churnings in Nepal over the past few decades and why the country is standing at this moment right now. Roman, I'll start with a very simple question that when the violence first happened and when 19 people were shot dead and next day we saw the protesters taking to the ground and burning down buildings and even attacking the parliament, a lot of the media reported that as this protest was due to ban on social media. Is that really so? Because in your article, you have said that there has been a churn for some time now because people have been tired of corruption. Take us through what has been happening over the past few months.
Sure. Of course, I think that the deepest roots of this, as I've laid out in my article as well, for anyone who wants to go deeper, go back years, you can trace it back decades as well. But in the more immediate sense, with the social media ban, which has been getting a lot of media attention, but I think that important to understand exactly what happened. And Dhanya, the way that you introduced and kind of contextualized this conversation, everything was spot on, which is not true of many other Indian media outlets. So congratulations on getting all of that right. The one small flaw, I think, there is, that the social media ban was seen as a way to suppress dissent. And yes, it was. But let me explain that, right? I think that basically the social media ban coming when it did amid the, right before the protests was in some ways a quirk of timing. I won't go into the deep details, but kind of the official mechanisms of the social media ban had to do with the fact that a bunch of social media platforms had not registered in Nepal, even though Nepal requires them to. And so the government had a mechanism that was moving, that was trying to get them to register. And at some point it said, okay, they are not registered, so now they will be banned. That seemed to kind of coincide with a moment on social media that had started a little bit before that. There was already, in kind of the lead up to the protest on Monday, on 8th of September, there was a moment on social media where young people were looking at the social media handles and the social media content from a lot of the children of political leaders and government ministers, figures in kind of the political class and the political establishment, and seeing the kind of lifestyles and wealth that they were flaunting, and they started asking, where is all this wealth coming from? Is this our tax money going into subsidizing these lifestyles, etc.? And so that's where kind of, the question of nepotism started to arise. And of course, corruption, which is, of course, a big part of the same set of questions. And so the initial organizing online by the young protesters that came out on Monday morning was really about nepotism and corruption. And then the social media ban came in right before the protests. And certainly there was talk of the ban being a way for the government to try and ban dissent. But I don't think that was necessarily the primary motivation of the government in terms of banning social media in that moment. Of course, when that ban came in, young people were saying, is this a way for them to try and silence us? And also, I think that the government handled that ban very badly. It came across in a way, it didn't feel consultative, and it felt extremely disconnected, I think is probably the word, from the way that social media is important, let's say, to the way that people live their lives, especially young people live their lives now. But also in terms of what it meant in terms of, the Nepali economy. For a lot of people, their livelihoods also have a lot to do with access to social media, or, you had even WhatsApp banned. And, for a lot of people who work remotely from Nepal, there were all these kinds of things that the government, I think that it was fair to expect that the government should take them into consideration, but it seemed to be acting without any care. And it reinforced this sense of a government that had lost all sense of responsibility towards its own people, who it is supposed to represent, and that was just acting without care. So that certainly added fuel to the fire. But I think that a lot of the reporting that has been kind of framing it as, the social media ban happened, and that's why there was this huge reaction that people are fighting for their social media, that isn't quite getting it right. And so that's kind of what happened, right? On Monday morning, you had the Gen Z protesters who gathered in the city, and then started walking towards Parliament, and then from there, you had the firings, etc.
So, help us understand the anger better, Roman, because this is not the first term for this prime minister, right? This is his third term. How have things changed or not changed for Nepali people? Why was this anger building for so long? Because here in India, we speak about high rates of unemployment. And I've been reading that it's the same in Nepal. There's poverty, there's unemployment. So how has this been building up for months?
Months, I think, or even years. I think that, in terms of the deeper history, we can trace it back to Nepal's earlier kind of popular uprisings against governments. And we've had a couple of them. Or a few of them, I should say, over the decades. And so, a lot of the underlying frustrations in terms of an unfair society, in terms of a government that isn't giving people a fair return, let's say, on their taxes and all of this kind of thing, that's been there for a long time. But I think that for the present moment, I think a good place to start understanding where all of this was coming from is the national election back in 2022. There was a new party that was formed called the RSP, Rashtriya Swatantra Party, formed by a former television anchor turned politician named Rabi Lamithane, which I think is a name that your listeners will be hearing a lot more in relation to Nepal in the coming days and weeks. And, this is a party that forms in the middle of the year, and by the end of the year, just months after they were formed, they do quite well, very surprisingly well in a national election. A lot of the support and the vote that they garnered was from urban areas. I think they took something like 10% of the vote total. And, in a way, this all just came out of the blue. I think that vote took a lot of people by surprise. And I think especially a lot of the establishment parties by surprise. Because the establishment parties had really been taking it for granted that they just, it's business as usual and they all get their share of the vote. We had three main parties, the Maoists, the Nepali Congress, and the CPN-UML, the Communist Party of Nepal United Marxist-Leninist, though I must say that they are not a very communist party, which I think is important to understand. So those parties were really taking voters and their power for granted, that no matter if one party won a bit more, a bit less, they would always strike deals that kind of kept the same set of people and parties in power. And the country was, clearly not benefiting from that, right? You would have changes in government. People would vote for one party more than the other, but you did not have any substantial change coming from that democratic process. And so in 2022, I think when people saw an alternative, and I'm putting the RSP as the center of focus here because it symbolizes this. But of course, there were also other, let's say, newer alternative political forces that also did surprisingly well. And I think, the what was happening in that moment is that people were already expressing an anger and just, a lot of just being fed up with the status quo. And they used their vote there, that 10% or, for the RSP, but also other forces to express that anger. And the hope, of course, was that would, again, kickstart some kind of change. Something similar happened in the Kathmandu municipal election, where somebody named Balen Shah, also a political upstart, also defeats two of the establishment parties very roundly, with a really big youth vote in Kathmandu, and also becomes, a very kind of surprising electoral victor. And again, I think that what was happening there was this was people's way of saying enough. We are tired of the old forces, right? And I think that from there, if you kind of fast forward to now, from that moment, and you can tell that, I mean, of course, for people to have voted that way in 2022, that anger and that frustration had already been building up. And then in 2022, you have the electoral sign of it. Now you have the frustration just completely boiling over, because since 2022 as well, that anger and that frustration has continued to build up. But there has not been any reform, any change to the old system to try and give people some sense that, okay, the old way is still working, or the old parties are still worth supporting. You were talking about youth unemployment and poverty. I think important to recognize that Nepal has made progress in the last couple of decades, let's say, right? Kind of the post-war years. The war finished roughly 2 decades ago now. But that progress has been very frustratingly slow. And I think that the general sense is that that progress has come despite the government very often, rather than because of anything that the government has done. Corruption is really, really endemic and massive. There have been a series of corruption scandals in recent years, again, where I think, that was just adding to the anger. In terms of youth unemployment, unemployment across the board is massive. You have, in a country of very roughly 30 million people, you have over 800,000 people leaving the country every year right now to go and work abroad. So you can imagine what that means as a share of the working age population. So there is this very clear sense that, your only future lies in going abroad and working there. And in terms of, the progress that Nepal has won, this hard-won progress, I think a lot of it has come on the backs of the millions of Nepalis now working abroad and sending back remittances, right? I think that has been part of the Nepal story. So even if, let's say, people's standards of living might have risen, there is not a sense that the government is working for us, and hence that standard of living is rising. It's very much that we are all working. We want good jobs. We want a fair deal in Nepali society. We want a political system that actually works for us. And probably we also want a future that gives us the option of staying and working in our own countries, where we don't feel like things are so hopeless here that the only thing I can do is to go abroad, right? So I think that in that way, look, there is massive inequality, poverty in Nepal, but I think that there has been some progress. But I think that progress, it's more about understanding how the people understand where that progress is coming from. And they do not think that the government is doing enough. The government, again, if we want to give due credit, there have been steps in the right direction. Again, very slow, very frustrating. But there have also been a lot of steps in the wrong direction. And fundamentally, I think, more than the social media ban, and more than just Gen Z, I think that what we've seen here is an uprising that goes well beyond Gen Z, right? I think that even though it started out with the Gen Z protest on Monday morning, the escalation, the very rapid escalation, I think says a lot about the fact that the complaints, the fundamental complaints of corruption, nepotism, a government that does not respect the people and does not think that it serves the people, only is and a political establishment that is really only trying to serve itself. That frustration cuts across many generations of Nepalis. It is not just Gen Z. And that's why you've seen this really big and really rapid escalation. So I think it's important to understand that, even though, kind of the tag that has been stuck onto this uprising is Gen Z protests, because that's where it started, especially what you saw in terms of the rioting and a lot of the violence in Kathmandu on the second day. I think at some point between Monday morning and all of that, it stopped being about Gen Z, right? I mean, at some point, of course, the mob takes over, and that's where you have so many horrific scenes of violence against people, and of course, a lot of vandalism of property, the parliament, the Supreme Court being burnt down. But I think that the sentiment was much more universal, even if I think a lot of people now are looking at the destruction and the loss of life, even of that second day, when the mobs were just running free, and saying, my God, that was probably not the right thing.
I want to now just ask about the names that are floating, which is first, of course, the former Chief Justice Sushila Karki to serve as the interim Prime Minister. There are reports that her name has been suggested and that I think she told one of the Indian news channels that she is okay with that. And you mentioned Balendra Shah. I think his name is also doing the rounds. In fact, I read an Indian Express story that he studied in Bengaluru. His MTech in engineering he did in India. So, of course, Indian connections are being dug out right now as to who becomes the next interim prime minister and what is their connection. How do you see things panning out from here? Because in your story, you wrote that this moment is Nepal's latest attempt at correction. It may not go down as a revolution. Certainly, no one is asking to overturn the system of government. So we need to be clear here that Nepalis are not asking for a different type of government. They want democracy, but they want someone else in charge, right?
So again, right, I have to say that this is an answer that I think, and what I was writing in that piece as well, it could well change because things are so uncertain right now, right? Even let's say as of this morning, there's talk of oh, are the monarchists going to try and very opportunistically use this moment to try and bring the monarchy back? Oh, is somebody else going to take advantage of the moment to try and rewrite the constitution? So I think I think that would be that would make the mess much worse. I think that the best course of action for Nepal is really to try and go through with the democratic process to have a change of power. Because I think, yes, the primary source of frustration has been that the people in power in the current system have really not done the job. There has not been a massive upswell against the system, the democratic system that we have, the constitution that we have. But again, in the coming days, it's very hard to tell which way things might go. I know there's a lot of disinformation now being passed around, right? I mean, in a moment like this, when there is a vacuum in power, things become very, very volatile and things can change very quickly. But you were talking about some of those names. I think that yes, there is very much a desire to move away from the old guard and to turn towards younger faces, right? And okay, Sushila Karki, the former Chief Justice who you were just talking about, yes, it does seem like she is the person that there's some consensus around as an interim leader for the country as we try to chart a way out of this whole mess. But I think she's certainly not young. She's retired from the court and would very much be, I guess, something like a Muhammad Yunus figure, I guess, if you want to draw rough parallels, at least to Bangladesh. Beyond that, I think a lot of Nepalis are looking for a new generation of leaders. The two names that I've brought up, Balensha and Robi Lamethane, are the ones that I think there's most focus on now. But I want to also emphasize that there are others. And there are others who I think will, in this kind of the political vacuum that is now opening up, will probably have their chance to show what they're all about. With some of these new names, and especially with Balensha, yes, you're right. Now it seems like Karki is the name that there's more consensus around, but there was also a lot of talk of maybe Balin Shah being kind of the candidate as an interim leader. And I think that's for I think a reasonable observer, there is reasonable ground for concern with that development. Partly because in terms of Balin Shah's actual base of support or even experience in government, it's all restricted only to Kathmandu. And he's been the mayor of Kathmandu for a good few years now. His record is frankly quite abysmal. It's been marked by a lot of administrative dysfunction, a lot of complaints of him operating in a very authoritarian way, not wanting to kind of follow the procedures of government and administration in any kind of smooth system. And his biggest accomplishment, I think, and I think few can disagree, would be the massive and growing cult of personality that he has built up online. And I think that, the fact that his name was being put forward so seriously, I think is a sign that right now a lot of the conversation is being driven by perceptions and images created online rather than a more sober assessment of what is actually, evident on the ground. I think that, in many ways, I think, of course, this is a massive moment of transition for Nepali politics. I think in many ways, the kind of influence that social media and the online realm has exercised on the politics of other countries, including India, I think Nepal is now starting to really catch up to that. I think Nepal has on that front been a little bit behind the curve. But with that, and of course, it's understandable that with that, you also have a young generation suddenly becoming much more active in politics. But there are also a lot of risks. And again, I think, all of your listeners in India will know this very well. The massive amounts of disinformation, the ways that you can manage perception without really caring about reality. And I think your readers know that even the current government in India is a master at this, right? Where the online truth, so to speak, becomes much more important than the real truth of what's actually being done, what the actual failures might be. So I think that there's very reasonable room for concern as to whether Balen Shah would be a good candidate to take the country forward. Now, look, if he stands for election and he wins the popular mandate, this is the democratic process, right? I will also say that he deserves a chance to show the country what he can do if the country has faith in him. And the same with Rabi Lameshane, the other candidate, who is, now there's a lot of talk and a lot of buzz around with him as well. And I explain why in my article at himalmag.com, as you were saying, Dhanya, around him as well, there is room for reasonable concern. So I think that, a lot of the attention now is focusing on these charismatic names that have a lot of purchase on social media, but really have not kind of earned the kind of record in government or even just, in terms of their own personal credibility, to say that, yes, these guys will be great for the country, right? I mean, with any new generation coming into power, there is always the risk that the same old problems of the past repeat themselves. I think that now going forward, Nepali politics is actually going to be exposed to a lot of the risks of social media in politics that India and many, many other countries have seen. And I think that that's going to be one more problem that we're going to have to navigate amid all the other problems going forward.
Okay, so for those wondering, Roman has been a journalist who practiced in India also. He was an associate editor with The Caravan. Roman, you have also been looking at the coverage in India, right? Immediately it was looked at as foreign funded. Yesterday, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, B.R. Gawai, said that we are proud of our constitution. Look at what is happening in Nepal. So what is happening in Nepal is talked about with caution in India. There's also one kind of media coverage which is injecting all sorts of conspiracies. How do you look at how India is looking at Nepal, or Indian media rather?
I think the most important thing to keep in mind in all of this is that, and I think, again, for listeners of the News Minute, I'm sure that they will already be aware. When you are watching the Indian media, you should be aware that the Indian media is saying nothing that is true about the countries that they are covering. And they are saying a lot of things about India itself. And I think that the mainstream Indian media's coverage of what's been happening in Nepal fits that pattern to a T. I've seen clips of an NDTV anchor, some guy on the street says, amid a lot of other things, he slips in a couple of words saying, we want somebody like Modi to lead the country. And of course, the NDTV guy jumps right on that. He's like, this is it. Look at this. Nepal also wants a Modi. Now, look, Modi is not part of the conversation here right now, right? Nepalis have to deal with our own country, and that's where our focus is. We are not thinking about India, but you can't tell that to the Indian media, right? They want to come in here and say, look, Nepal wants Modi, but that's the agenda of the Indian media, and that says a lot about the politics and the agendas of India than it does about Nepal. I've seen coverage that on one of the Gautam media channels that now Nepal is also going to go towards Hindutva, and that is what this moment is about. No, there's actually a lot of concern that Hindutva forces might opportunistically take advantage of this moment. But that is not what brought people out onto the streets. And it's a gross misrepresentation of what's happening in Nepal to say that. But again, that is much more revealing of the agendas of the Indian media and Indian politics, right? This is not the first time, I think, that the Indian media wants to create this fantasy where Nepal is also desperately striving to go back to being a Hindu country, a Hindu kingdom in our case. But they want sound bites that reinforce that narrative, and on the rare occasions where they will grab one of those sound bites, they will amplify it enormously. But if you want an actual soundbite from Nepal for India, I mean, look, we've been a Hindu nation, and it doesn't work. It wasn't good. That's not what the Indian media right now wants to hear. But actually, if you come here and you talk to enough Nepalis, I think a lot of Nepalis will also tell you, don't go there. It took us a civil war to undo that. And I think for India especially, that is not a good direction to go. But again, the mainstream Indian media is here to only promote its own agendas. It is not here to give anybody in India a fair representation of what is happening in Nepal.
Yesterday, I think there was a press meet by the army chief, General Ashok Raj Sigdal, and there's a lot of speculation that why did we have a picture of the monarch behind him? We saw King Gyanendra reacting to the entire violence. So could you explain more as to why some sections believe that this could be a push for the monarchy to come back? And is that something that could actually happen?
In the realm of could, who's to say what may and may not happen, right? I think that right now, in the search for alternative political forces, I think that, yes, a lot of people could well turn to the monarchy. I don't think that there is any kind of overwhelming sentiment towards the monarchy right now. But again, as you know, with the manipulation of narratives online and disinformation campaigns, there could well be an attempt and a campaign to bring the monarchy back into the picture in a much bigger way. I think that the army has historically a very long and very close relationship with the royal family. I think that right now it does not so far seem like the army is trying to make any play for political power. And I think that is something to be grateful for, and also watch very carefully, because I think it needs to stay that way. In terms of the king, I think, again, the monarchist forces have been trying to take advantage of any opportunity that presents itself to try and reinsert this idea of the Hindu kingdom into the conversation. I think that how much that sentiment exists will have to be tested at the ballot box. There is, of course, that danger that there might be another swing back towards the monarchy. I think the important thing now is for Nepalis to remember their history, and I think especially with a young generation who did not live through the monarchy, right? Because again, it's been almost 20 years since the end of the Civil War, so a lot of the young people who are now coming of political age do not have that memory. So I think that there is an opportunity to also rewrite that history and to manipulate that history, as we've seen in so many countries where, especially with online disinformation, you can change how people remember things. I think there's a very big danger that there is a rewriting of the history of the monarchy, because, to be very frank, we had so many years of monarchy, and right now the narrative that is being pushed is that if we get the king back, then that will solve all of our problems. But no, the monarchy has been in charge of this country historically for longer than anything else, any other force, and yet we are not, the problems were never fixed. That was not a good moment. We had two popular we had three popular uprisings at various times and in various ways shake off autocratic control. First, from these hereditary prime ministers called the Ranas in the 50s, who were also kind of tied to the monarchical system, though they were basically usurping the power of the kings. And then, you have 1990, you have the end of the Civil War, when again you have two massive uprisings, very in some ways very similar to the ones to the one we're having now, where people rose up to say this system is rotten. We cannot keep going with the monarchy. I think it's very important for Nepalis to remember that history. For us to go back to monarchy would just be to go back to the same mess. We've tried that and it's not worked. And it's very important for us to keep that history in mind.
I have two final questions, Roman. First is that um, geopolitically, also, how do you think this will play out? Because there's China, there's India, there is going to be influence of the neighbors, right? What is the talk on the ground about this?
Honestly, right now, I think that I think this is one of the issues that I see with Indian coverage, not just of Nepal, but I think of anything that happens in the neighborhood. Like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, anywhere. The immediate question is, oh, what does this mean for India? But also, what does this mean in terms of India versus China? Look, Nepal, like Bangladesh, like Sri Lanka, is its own country. We are not just some extension of India. So we are not thinking in those terms, right? For us, we are thinking about what does this mean for our country. Yes, I'm sure there will be geopolitical implications. But I think that right now it's way too early to know what those will be. I think that a lot will depend on how India plays its cards. And I think that you can only you need only look at, let's say, Bangladesh, where I think that the Indian government has alienated this new emerging government, or I mean both the interim government and also kind of the new political process. The process and this movement for political reform in Bangladesh has been completely alienated and antagonized by the Indian government, and a lot of that is down to the policies and the choices that the Indian government is also making, right? I think that in Nepal, India has and I think this is something that a lot of Indians would not be aware of, a long history of manipulating political processes to the extent possible. And let me be honest, the Nepali political establishment is also completely complicit in that, because they will try to use influence and support from New Delhi to their own advantages here. So in this way, India has historically engaged in a lot of manipulation of, attempted and successful at times manipulation of Nepali politics. I think that what India needs to be asking itself is, which side of the popular movement now do we want to be on? Do we say, do we extend support to this? Yes, admittedly, it will be a messy process of transition as Nepal tries to reconfigure its politics to build something better. New Delhi has the choice to say, we will just be in support of that, the way that, let's say, a good neighbor can be. Or they can start to play games of manipulation, trying to play one side against the other. These are patterns that, for anybody who's observed Nepali politics in Nepal will be very familiar from, coming from New Delhi. If India tries to engage in that kind of manipulation again, the risks are really, really high, because, if that can backfire, and it has backfired on India many times. I think that Indian regional foreign policy for South Asia in the last decade or so, I think there are a lot of critical questions that need to be raised. Sadly, in India, given the environment, I think there is not enough analysis and criticism of these things. But I think that right now, the way that India looks at it always is through this India versus China lens. That is not the lens, I think, to understand what is happening in Nepal. I think that India needs to cast the lens on its own policies in Nepal if it wants to maintain good standing here. In terms of where China comes in, I think that, again, there's this Indian paranoia that Nepal is moving towards China and moving away from India. For Nepalis, it is not a zero-sum game the way that India imagines it to be. Again, we are a sovereign country that will look at the many complex and often difficult choices that we have to make in our own foreign policy and navigate those as best we can. And yes, there will be changes from government to government, administration to administration. From one politician to the next, people will have different leanings. That is, of course, entirely natural. I think that the greatest danger, if India is really afraid of, quote unquote, losing Nepal to China, is that India will act in a way that backfires on India. And if that happens, of course, that will likely play into the hands of all the countries that India would rather not have with greater influence in the country, right? So I think that really, rather than Indians looking at this as Nepal now having to choose whether it wants to be friends with India or China, Nepalis don't think of it that way. I think India needs to look at itself and say, what can we do to make sure that we are not burning bridges in Kathmandu now?
My final question to you is, how are Nepalis looking at its own media? Because I saw this one news development that a TV channel's office, Kantipur TV, was set on fire. Kathmandu Post, of course, put out a post that they are continuing to cover this, though there are various setbacks. How do Nepalis look at what the media's role has been in that country over the last few years?
I think that, yeah, it's in some ways a quite scary moment for the media here as well, especially for the media house that you were talking about, Kantipur, right? Their headquarters was set on fire. The reason for that is that there was and is a widespread perception that Kantipur is politically compromised, and that the media is part of the problem. I think that important. I think to really condemn that. I think no attack on the press can be good or justified, and this is something that deserves a lot of critical scrutiny and concern. I think, yeah, and I also know I've seen reports from somebody who was on the ground that the mobs, when they were running free on Tuesday, there were attempts to set a van full of journalists on fire, because the mobs were saying that these are all compromised, because there's this perception, or at least in parts of Nepali society, that the media is part of the problem, that the media and journalists were also complicit in the old establishment. So I think for the Nepali media as well, I think this is going to be a very difficult time. I think that there might well, I really hope there will not be more attacks on journalists, but I think that there might well be. And, I think it is unfair to paint all, look, there are a lot of problems with the Nepali media. I won't go into the details here, but this is not at all to say that the Nepali media does not need to take a hard look at itself and also think about reform. But I think that, targeting individual journalists and trying to set a van full of journalists on fire when they were out there actually trying to document and to report on what was actually happening, which is a very important function. I think that that's hugely concerning, and I think something that deserves more scrutiny in the days ahead, because if there is more targeting of journalists in this way, I think that that's something that deserves a lot of condemnation and criticism and action to stop it.
I guess one thing that's common in India and in Nepal would be that the media does have a lot to reflect on itself. Thank you very much for joining us here on the News Minute, Roman, and to everyone listening and watching. Do not forget to follow Himal Mag's coverage. Of course, they will not have breaking news or minute-by-minute coverage of what's happening, but they will give you a proper outlook on how things have been panning out. So looking forward to more articles from you, Roman, and from the Himal team. Tough days ahead for you, so all the very best too.
Thank you so much, Dhanya. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you, and keep watching the News Minute. And do not forget, both Himal and the News Minute run on subscriptions by readers and their audiences. So you could log on to Himal Bag, you could log on to thenewsminute.com and take a subscription.